Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you appreciate modern hospitals in a whole new way. We're talking about childbirth in medieval times, when bringing life into the world was literally more dangerous than going to battle. Before we start this journey together, hit that like button if you're ready to learn something that'll change how you see history forever. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community come together for these deep dives into the past. Now get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink and prepare yourself. Because tonight, we're going back to a time when becoming a mother was the ultimate gamble with death itself. Imagine you're a woman in 1347. You just discovered you're pregnant. In our time, this might be cause for celebration, careful planning, and excitement about baby showers and nursery colors. But in medieval Europe, you just received what might as well be a death sentence. Because in the next 9 months, you'll face odds that would make a soldier think twice about going to war. Welcome to a world where motherhood wasn't just a blessing. It was a deadly lottery that most women lost. Number 1. The deadly odds of survival. Let's start with some numbers that'll make your blood run cold. In medieval Europe, for every 3 women who went into labor, one of them wouldn't live to see her baby's first birthday. Think about that for a second. 1 in 3. Those aren't odds you take at a casino, but medieval women had no choice. You wake up one morning in 1350 and you feel the first pangs of labor. Your heart starts racing, but not from excitement, from terror. Because your mother knows, your neighbors know, that you might not survive the day. In fact, you're more likely to die in childbirth than your husband is to die in the war he's fighting 2 villages over. The numbers were brutal and honest. In some regions, maternal mortality rates reached as high as 40%. That means in a village of 100 pregnant women, 40 might not survive their births. Compare that to war, where even in the bloodiest battles, soldiers had better survival rates. A knight going into combat had roughly a 15% chance of dying. A woman going into labor, double that, sometimes triple. But why were the odds so stacked against mothers? Let's paint the picture of what you're facing as a medieval woman about to give birth. First, there's your age. Girls often married at 12 or 13, and pregnancy followed quickly. Your body hasn't finished developing, but society expects you to start producing heirs immediately. Your pelvis is too narrow, your body too small, but nobody cares about medical readiness. They care about family alliances and inheritance. Second, there's your health going into pregnancy. You've probably already had multiple pregnancies by age 20. Each one has weakened your body further. You're malnourished because the best food goes to your husband and sons. You work in the fields until the day you go into labor. You're anemic, exhausted, and your body is already breaking down. Third, there's what happens when complications arise. And complications will arise. Breech births, twins, prolonged labor, hemorrhaging, infections. In our time, these are manageable with medical intervention. In medieval times, they're death sentences. Let me tell you about Agnes, typical medieval mother. She's 19, married at 13, and this is her 4th pregnancy. Her first baby died within a week. Her second was stillborn. Her third lived but left her with injuries that never properly healed. Now she's facing labor again, and she knows the odds. Agnes lives in a 1-room hut with a dirt floor. There's no clean water, no sterilized anything, no knowledge of germs or infection. When her labor begins, she doesn't call a doctor because there aren't any. She calls for the village midwife, an older woman whose only qualification is that she's helped other women give birth and hasn't killed too many of them. The midwife arrives with her bag of tools. And when I say tools, I mean a rusty knife, some dirty rags, and maybe a bottle of ale to dull the pain. That's it. That's medieval medical technology for one of the most dangerous experiences a human can endure. Agnes labors for 18 hours. Her baby is breech, meaning it's coming out feet first instead of head first. In our time, this would mean an immediate C-section in a sterile operating room with anesthesia and trained surgeons. For Agnes, it means the midwife will try to turn the baby by hand, reaching inside her with unwashed hands, tearing tissue, causing infection. If Agnes survives the birth, she faces weeks of recovery with no medical care. Any tears or damage to her body will heal however they heal, often leaving her in chronic pain or with disabilities. If she gets an infection, she'll probably die within days, sweating and delirious. But here's the thing that makes this even more heartbreaking. Agnes knows all of this. Every woman does. They live with the knowledge that pregnancy might be their death sentence. They write their wills when they discover they're pregnant. They say goodbye to their children and husband, just in case. Imagine living in a world where becoming pregnant feels like playing Russian roulette. Where every time you miss your monthly bleeding, you wonder if you've just signed your death warrant. Where pregnancy announcements aren't celebrations but funeral preparations. And the cruel irony? Medieval society desperately needed children. Infant mortality was so high that families needed multiple children just to ensure some survived to adulthood. So women faced this deadly gamble over and over again. 5 pregnancies, 7 pregnancies, 10 pregnancies. Each one rolling the dice with death. The church made it worse by teaching that this was God's will. Women were supposed to suffer in childbirth as punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. So not only were they dying at terrifying rates, they were told this was their spiritual duty. Their pain, their terror, their deaths were all part of God's plan. Think about what this meant for families. Husbands watched their wives die in agony, knowing there was nothing they could do. Children watched their mothers disappear into labor and never come back. Fathers buried wife after wife, marrying again and again, hoping the next one might survive long enough to raise the children. The psychological trauma was unimaginable. But it was so common, so expected, that people just accepted it as normal. Death in childbirth wasn't a tragedy, it was Tuesday. And if you think this was just about poor peasant women, think again. Queens, duchesses, and noblewomen died just as frequently. Having money didn't buy you better medical care because better medical care didn't exist. Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI. Catherine of Aragon suffered multiple miscarriages and lost several children in infancy. Even royal wombs were battlefields where survival was never guaranteed. The numbers don't lie. Medieval warfare killed thousands of men over years of fighting. Medieval childbirth killed just as many women, one labor at a time. The difference? Men had weapons, armor, and tactics to improve their odds. Women had prayers and hope. So the next time you see a romantic medieval movie with beautiful ladies in flowing gowns, remember Agnes. Remember the 1 in 3 who didn't make it. Remember that for medieval women, the most dangerous thing they could do wasn't face a dragon or fight in battle. It was try to become a mother. Number 2, the midwives and their strange tools. Now that you understand the deadly odds, let's meet the women who were supposed to help you survive childbirth. If you were lucky, your village had a midwife. If you were unlucky, your village had a midwife. Because medieval midwifery was less about medical knowledge and more about crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. Picture this, you're in active labor, screaming in pain, and in walks your midwife. She's usually an older woman, maybe 50 or 60, which in medieval terms makes her practically ancient. She's survived multiple childbirths herself, buried a few babies, and maybe lost a daughter or two to the same process she's now helping you through. Her qualifications? She's delivered babies before, and most of them didn't die immediately. That's it. That's the entire medical degree. Medieval midwives weren't trained in schools or hospitals because those didn't exist. They learned by watching other midwives, and those midwives learned by watching their midwives, going back generations of women who were basically making it up as they went along. Imagine playing telephone with life and death medical procedures, and you'll start to understand medieval midwifery. Let's look inside a midwife's bag, shall we? First, there's her knife. Not a sterile surgical scalpel, but whatever sharp blade she could find. Maybe it was used to cut bread that morning, or to skin a rabbit, or to clean under her fingernails. The concept of sterilization won't be invented for another few hundred years, so everything she owns is contaminated with bacteria, dirt, and whatever else she's touched recently. She carries strips of cloth for tying off the umbilical cord. These rags might be clean, might not be. Probably not. They're whatever fabric she could find, tear apart, and stuff in her bag. Some midwives reuse the same cloth strips for multiple births. If the last mother died of infection, well, these strips might be carrying that infection to you. In her bag, there's also a bottle of something alcoholic. Ale wine or maybe some homemade spirits. This serves multiple purposes. It's supposed to clean wounds, although it doesn't really work that way. It's meant to dull your pain, although medieval alcohol was weak and you'd have to drink gallons to feel any real relief. And honestly, the midwife probably drinks most of it herself to steady her nerves, because she knows she's about to attempt something that could easily kill both you and your baby. Some midwives carried what they called birthing stones. These were smooth rocks that laboring women were supposed to hold or sit on for luck. The stones were passed from mother to mother, accumulating decades of sweat, blood, and bacteria. But hey, they were traditional, and tradition was all they had. More superstitious midwives brought bags of herbs that were supposed to help with labor. Feverfew to reduce pain, except it didn't. Pennyroyal to speed up contractions, except was actually poisonous and could kill you. Mugwort for protection against evil spirits, because obviously evil spirits were a major concern during childbirth. These herbs were usually mixed into teas that tasted terrible and did absolutely nothing helpful. Now about those tools. The midwife's most important tool was her hands, which brings us to our first major problem. Medieval people didn't understand germs, bacteria, or infection. The midwife might have just delivered another baby, handled a sick patient, used the bathroom, or helped slaughter a pig. She'd rinse her hands in the same water she used for everything else, which was probably contaminated already, and then reach inside you to help guide the baby out. Her hands were rough from a lifetime of manual labor. Her fingernails were long and dirty because cutting them short wasn't a common practice. If she had cuts or sores on her hands, which she probably did, those became direct pathways for infection to travel from her body to yours. Every time she touched you, she was potentially introducing deadly bacteria into your system. For difficult births, midwives had hooks. Yes, hooks. Sharp metal implements that they used to try to extract babies who were stuck or positioned wrong. These hooks weren't designed by doctors or medical professionals. They were made by the local blacksmith who usually made horseshoes and farming tools. The same guy who shod your horse also made the instruments that might save your life. Feel confident yet? If the baby died during birth, the midwife had tools to remove it piece by piece. I won't go into graphic detail, but imagine the most horrifying thing you can think of, and medieval reality was probably worse. These procedures almost always killed the mother too. But they tried anyway, because leaving a dead baby inside would definitely kill her. Some midwives carried birth chairs, special seats with holes in them designed to let the baby fall through. The theory was that gravity would help speed up delivery. The reality was that these chairs were shared between multiple women, never cleaned, and often collapsed under the strain. Women fell off them, got splinters, and sometimes bled to death because the chair positioned them wrong. The fancier midwives had mirrors, not for checking their appearance, but because they believed that looking at their own reflection during labor would help women push more effectively. This was based on absolutely no medical knowledge whatsoever, but it sounded reasonable to people who thought the stars controlled your personality. Here's what's really wild. Midwives often worked in complete darkness. Childbirth usually happened at night, and they had to work by candlelight or oil lamp. They were essentially performing complex medical procedures while squinting in flickering shadows. Imagine trying to deliver a breech baby when you can barely see what you're doing. Many midwives were also responsible for determining whether a difficult birth was caused by witchcraft. If the labor was taking too long, if the baby was positioned wrong, or if there were complications, the midwife might declare that evil magic was involved. This could lead to the laboring woman being accused of witchcraft, which carried the death penalty. So not only was your midwife medically unqualified, she might also get you burned at the stake. The payment for midwives was usually whatever the family could afford. A chicken, some grain, maybe a few coins. This meant that many midwives were desperate, poor women who took the job because they had no other options. They weren't choosing this work because they felt called to help mothers. They were doing it because they needed to eat. And here's the kicker, midwives were often blamed when things went wrong. If the mother died, it was the midwife's fault. If the baby died, the midwife must have made a mistake. If both died, the midwife might be accused of murder or witchcraft. So these women were risking their own lives and reputations every time they helped with a birth. But despite all of this, midwives were often the only people who showed any kindness to laboring women. They held their hands, spoke softly to them, and tried to provide some comfort in the terrifying experience of medieval childbirth. They weren't trained, they weren't equipped, and they weren't really qualified, but they were there. In a world that saw women's pain as deserved punishment, midwives at least try to help. The tragedy is that some midwives did develop real skill and knowledge through experience. They learned which positions might help a difficult birth, how to massage and encourage the baby to turn, and how to provide emotional support. But this knowledge died with them because there was no way to record or pass it on systematically. Each midwife started from scratch, learning through trial and error, with your life hanging in the balance. So when you went into labor in medieval times, you were putting your life in the hands of a well-meaning but unqualified woman armed with dirty tools, superstitious beliefs, and whatever folk wisdom she'd picked up over the years. She cared about you, she wanted you to survive, but she was essentially flying blind in the most dangerous medical situation you'd ever face. Number 3. Pain relief? Try prayers. Now let's talk about what you do for pain relief during medieval childbirth. Spoiler alert, you suffered. You suffered completely consciously and without any real help because medieval society believed your agony was not only normal but spiritually necessary. First, let's understand what childbirth pain actually involves. Modern women who've given birth with epidurals often describe labor as the most intense experience of their lives. Now imagine that same experience, but amplified because your body is malnourished and weakened, multiplied because you might be in labor for days, and with absolutely nothing to dull the sensation. Every contraction, every tear, every moment of the baby moving through your body, you feel in full screaming detail. But here's where medieval thinking gets really twisted. They didn't want you to have pain relief. The church taught that women were supposed to suffer during childbirth as punishment for original sin. Remember Genesis 3 verse 16, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children." This wasn't just a description, it was a prescription. Your suffering was holy. Your agony was God's will. So what did medieval women do for pain? They prayed. They prayed hard. They prayed desperately. They prayed while screaming in agony. The midwife would recite prayers over you, your family would pray in the next room, and you'd try to pray between contractions. Prayer was literally the only pain management system available to most women. Some women clutched religious relics during labor. A splinter of wood claimed to be from the cross, a scrap of cloth supposedly touched by a saint, or a bone fragment from some long-dead holy person. These relics were passed around from woman to woman, accumulating germs and bacteria, but desperate mothers believed they might provide divine protection or pain relief. They didn't, but hope was all they had. Wealthier women might have access to what passed for medieval painkillers. Opium existed, but was incredibly rare and expensive, imported from distant lands and available only to royalty. Even then, medieval people didn't understand proper dosing. Too little, and it did nothing. Too much, and it killed you. Most women never even saw opium, let alone had it available during labor. Some midwives brewed herbal teas that were supposed to dull pain. Willow bark contained a compound similar to aspirin, but medieval people didn't know that. They'd give you a bitter tea made from boiling bark, hoping it would help, not understanding why it sometimes worked a tiny bit. Other herbs like valerian or chamomile might have had mild calming effects, but we're talking about the equivalent of sipping weak herbal tea to manage the pain of major surgery. Alcohol was sometimes used, but medieval ale and wine were much weaker than modern alcohol. You'd have to drink enormous quantities to feel any numbing effect, and drinking that much during labor would probably kill both you and your baby. Plus, most families couldn't afford to waste their alcohol on pain relief when it was needed for nutrition and trade. The most common pain management technique was biting down on something. A piece of wood, a strip of leather, or a cloth bundle. The idea was that biting down hard would give you something to focus on besides the pain and prevent you from screaming loud enough to disturb the entire village. Women literally bit through pieces of wood during particularly difficult labors. Some midwives tried distraction techniques. They'd tell stories, sing songs, or engage the laboring woman in conversation to take her mind off the pain. This actually wasn't a terrible idea, but it only worked during the milder contractions. When serious labor kicked in, no amount of storytelling could distract from what your body was going through. Position was sometimes used to manage pain, though medieval people didn't understand why. Some midwives discovered that certain positions felt slightly better for laboring women. Squatting, leaning forward, or walking around might ease the pain a tiny bit. But many labors took place with a woman lying flat on her back, which is actually one of the most painful positions for giving birth. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Medieval people thought that screaming during labor was bad for the baby. They believed that if you cried out in pain, you'd frighten the child and make the birth more difficult. So women were actively discouraged from expressing their agony. They were supposed to suffer in silence, like good Christian women accepting their punishment from God. Breathing techniques weren't understood, but some women instinctively discovered that certain breathing patterns helped manage pain. Of course, when you're in agony for 20 hours straight, it's hard to maintain any kind of breathing control. Most women hyperventilated, passed out from pain, or simply screamed until their voices gave out. Some regions had folk beliefs about pain management that were completely useless but gave women something to focus on. Wearing your husband's shirt during labor was supposed to transfer some of the pain to him. Keeping iron objects nearby was thought to ward off evil spirits that caused pain. Opening all the doors and windows in the house was believed to help the baby come out easier. None of this worked, but it gave desperate women something to try. The wealthy sometimes had access to early forms of distraction that might have helped psychologically. Musicians to play soft music, servants to fan them and wipe their brows, or multiple attendants to provide comfort. But the pain was still the same. Having a harp player in the room didn't make contractions hurt any less. And here's the most heartbreaking part. Women were told their pain was a measure of their faith. If you suffered more, you were a better Christian. If you screamed and struggled, you were weak and sinful. If you begged for relief, you were rejecting God's plan. So on top of the physical agony, women carried psychological guilt for not being strong enough to bear their holy punishment with dignity. Some women did find ways to mentally cope with the pain. They'd repeat prayers like mantras, focus on religious imagery, or try to offer up their suffering for the souls in purgatory. This was a form of meditation that might have provided some small psychological relief, even if it didn't touch the physical pain. But let's be honest about what this really meant. Medieval women gave birth in screaming agony, without any effective pain relief, often for days at a time. They bit through pieces of wood, passed out from pain, and sometimes went insane from the prolonged torture of difficult labor. And society told them this was not only normal, but holy. The lucky ones had quick labors that were over in a few hours. The unlucky ones labor for days, suffering through contractions that felt like being torn apart from the inside, with nothing but prayer and willpower to sustain them. Some women literally died from the pain itself, their hearts giving out under the strain of prolonged agony. When anesthesia was first used for childbirth in the 19th century, religious leaders opposed it, claiming it was against God's will to eliminate the pain women were supposed to endure. It took decades to overcome the belief that female suffering during birth was spiritually necessary. Medieval women lived and died under that belief system, enduring unimaginable pain because society told them it was their sacred duty to suffer. Number 4. Curses and superstitions. Welcome to the medieval mind, where every complication in childbirth wasn't caused by medical factors, but by magic, curses, and supernatural forces beyond human control. If you think modern people can be superstitious, wait until you hear what medieval folks believed about pregnancy and birth. Let's start with the biggest superstition of all. If something went wrong during your pregnancy or labor, it was probably your fault for doing something evil or cursed. Medieval people believed that a woman's thoughts, actions, and even her dreams during pregnancy could directly affect her unborn child. This wasn't just folk belief, this was backed by the church and accepted as scientific fact. Picture this, you're 6 months pregnant in 1348, and you accidentally see a person with a physical deformity on the market day. Maybe someone with a cleft lip, or a missing limb, or unusual birthmarks. According to medieval belief, your baby will now be born with that same deformity because you impressed the image onto your unborn child by looking at it. This wasn't metaphorical. People literally believed that what pregnant women saw would magically transfer to their babies. So pregnant women lived in constant fear of seeing anything unusual or frightening. They'd cover their eyes when passing beggars with visible disabilities, avoid looking at animals with injuries, and pray constantly that they wouldn't accidentally glimpse something that might mark their child. The psychological stress of trying to control every visual experience for 9 months was enormous. But it gets worse. If your baby was born with any kind of birth defect, the community would immediately start asking what you did wrong during pregnancy. Did you look at a hair and give your baby a cleft lip? Did you see a person with a withered arm and cause your child to be born missing fingers? The mother was always blamed, and she often believed it herself. Here's a fun medieval belief. If you craved certain foods during pregnancy and didn't get them, your baby would be born with a birthmark shaped like that food. wants strawberries but can't afford them. Your baby gets a strawberry-shaped mark. Desperately want meat but only have bread? Your child will have meat-colored patches on their skin. Pregnant women and their families lived in terror of unsatisfied cravings. Eclipse during pregnancy? Congratulations, your baby will definitely be born deformed or evil. Medieval people believed that celestial events directly influenced unborn children, so pregnant women had to hide indoors during eclipses, meteor showers, and unusual astronomical events. They'd stuff cloth in their windows and pray that the cosmic forces wouldn't reach their babies. Some regions believed that arguing with your husband during pregnancy would cause the baby to be born angry or violent. Others thought that being frightened by loud noises would make the child deaf. If you cried too much, your baby would be born sad. If you laughed too much, your child would be born simple-minded. Pregnant women were expected to maintain perfect emotional control for 9 months, which is obviously impossible. Let's talk about the superstitions around the actual birth process. If labor took too long, it obviously meant someone had cursed you. The midwife would start looking for signs of witchcraft. Had any of your neighbors given you strange looks lately? Had anyone offered you food or drink that might have been enchanted? Did you accidentally offend someone who might have magical powers? Medieval people believed that knots had magical power over childbirth. If your labor was difficult, someone might have tied knots in string or rope to bind your womb and prevent the baby from coming out. The solution was to untie every knot in your house. Untie your shoelaces, loosen your belt, open every door and drawer, unbraid your hair. Anything that was closed or tied had to be opened to release the magical binding. Here's where it gets really dark. If both mother and baby died during childbirth, the community often assumed witchcraft was involved. Not medical complications that could be understood and prevented, but evil magic cast by someone with supernatural powers. This led to witch hunts, where grieving families would accuse neighbors, rivals, or anyone they disliked of murdering mother and child through sorcery. Old women were particularly suspected of causing birth complications through curses. If an elderly woman had argued with a pregnant mother, visited her home, or even looked at her wrong, she might be accused of casting an evil spell. Hundreds of older women were tortured and executed based on nothing more than being present when a birth went badly. Some superstitions were attempts to protect against these supposed curses. Pregnant women wore amulets made from specific stones, metals, or animal parts. Iron was considered especially protective against evil magic, so many women wore iron jewelry or kept iron objects in their birthing rooms. These amulets were often passed down through families, accumulating the hopes and fears of generations of mothers. Religious relics were huge in medieval childbirth superstitions. A piece of the Virgin Mary's cloak, a fragment of a saint's bone, or a bit of wood from the true cross were believed to provide divine protection during labor. Of course, most of these relics were fake, but desperate families spent enormous amounts of money on them anyway. Here's a superstition that actually made things more dangerous. Many people believe that if a laboring woman screamed or cried out, she was letting evil spirits into her body. So women were pressured to suffer in silence, not just because pain was considered holy, but because making noise was thought to invite demonic possession. This prevented women from getting the emotional support and comfort they desperately needed. Birth order superstitions were also common. If you were having your first child, people believed it would be more difficult because you hadn't opened the path yet. If you'd had multiple children, each birth was supposed to be easier because your body remembered what to do. If a later birth was actually more difficult, it meant something supernatural was interfering. The timing of birth mattered enormously in medieval superstition. Babies born during thunderstorms would grow up to be violent. Children born on holy days were blessed. Babies who arrived during the full moon would be lunatics. Birth on certain days of the week determined personality. Monday's child was fair of face, Tuesday's child was full of grace, and so on. If a baby was born with a caul of a membrane covering their head, it was considered either extremely lucky or terrifyingly unlucky, depending on local beliefs. Some regions thought caul babies would have psychic powers. Others believed they were marked by the devil. The caul itself became a magical object, preserved and either treasured or destroyed based on what people thought it meant. Here's the cruelest superstition of all. If a mother died in childbirth, some communities believed her ghost would return to steal other babies. These revenant mothers were thought to be so grief-stricken by their own deaths that they'd haunt other families, causing infant deaths and birth complications. So not only did families grieve their lost mothers, They fear them as supernatural threats. The psychological impact of these superstitions was devastating. Pregnant women lived in constant fear that their thoughts, actions, or mere existence might doom their children. They blamed themselves for complications that were completely beyond their control. And when tragedy struck, instead of receiving medical explanations and support, they got accusations of moral failure or supernatural interference. Even successful births weren't free from superstitious anxiety. If the baby was born healthy but later became sick, people looked for supernatural explanations. Had someone given the child the evil eye? Was there a family curse? Had they failed to properly protect the infant from magical influences? Parents lived in constant fear that invisible forces were threatening their children. These beliefs weren't harmless folk customs. They were dangerous superstitions that prevented people from understanding the real causes of maternal and infant mortality. Instead of developing better medical knowledge, medieval society blamed magic, curses, and moral failings. Women died not just from lack of medical care, but from a worldview that made their suffering seem inevitable and supernatural rather than preventable and medical. Number 5. Dangerous medical practices. Now we get to the really horrifying part. When normal childbirth wasn't going well, medieval medicine stepped in to help. And by help, I mean make everything infinitely worse through procedures that were more like torture than treatment. Let's say you've been in labor for 2 days. In modern times, doctors would assess the situation, perhaps perform a C-section, and save both mother and baby. In medieval times, they assumed something was blocking the natural process, and their solution was to force it through whatever means necessary. The first medical intervention was usually manual manipulation. The midwife would reach inside you with her unwashed hands and try to turn the baby, pull it out, or push it into position. Remember, she had no understanding of anatomy, no knowledge of sterile technique, and no training beyond watching other midwives do the same thing. She was essentially improvising life or death surgery with her bare hands. If the baby was positioned wrong, stuck, or too large, medieval practitioners had tools to help extract it. These tools were metal hooks, clamps, and grabbing devices that were designed to latch onto whatever part of the baby they could reach and pull it out by force. The technical term for these instruments was crotchets, and they were exactly as horrible as they sound. Picture a large, sharp hook designed to pierce the baby's skull or grab onto a limb so the midwife could yank the child out of the birth canal. These hooks weren't precision medical instruments. They were crude metal tools made by blacksmiths who had no understanding of human anatomy. The midwife would force the hook inside the mother, try to catch hold of the baby, and then pull with all her strength. Obviously, this process almost always killed the baby. But medieval thinking was that if the baby was already stuck and likely dead anyway, it was better to remove it quickly before the mother died too. The problem was that these hooks caused massive trauma to the mother's internal organs. The pulling and tearing usually resulted in severe hemorrhaging, infection, and death within days. For babies that were definitely dead but still inside the mother, midwives had even more horrific tools. They used instruments called cranioclast to crush the baby's skull and collapse it enough to remove it. Other tools were designed to cut the dead baby into pieces small enough to extract individually. I won't describe these procedures in detail, but imagine the most gruesome thing possible, and medieval reality was worse. But wait, there's more. If the placenta didn't come out naturally after birth, medieval midwives would reach inside and try to scrape it out with their hands or crude instruments. They had no understanding that leaving some placental tissue inside could cause infection, or that removing it incorrectly could cause massive bleeding. They just grabbed whatever they could feel and pulled until it came out. Caesarean sections existed in medieval times, but they were essentially death sentences for the mother. The procedure was only performed when the mother was already dead or dying, and the goal was to try to save the baby. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of proper surgical technique, and no way to prevent infection. Medieval C-sections were performed with whatever sharp knife was available, often by people who had never done surgery before. The few women who survived cesarean births usually died within days from infection, bleeding, or shock. But occasionally, incredibly rarely, both mother and baby survived. These cases were considered miraculous interventions by God, because medically speaking, survival was nearly impossible. Here's a medieval practice that'll make your skin crawl. If labor wasn't progressing fast enough, some midwives would try to speed it up by inserting foreign objects into the birth canal. Pieces of wood, metal rods, or specially carved tools were supposed to open the way for the baby. These objects were never sterile, often caused internal injuries, and frequently led to fatal infections. Medieval doctors, the few who existed, sometimes prescribed treatments that were actively harmful. Bloodletting during labor was common because they believed that removing excess blood would help the birthing process. So they'd take a woman who was already weak from labor and make her even weaker by draining her blood. This often caused women to pass out from blood loss at the exact moment when they needed all their strength. Some regions practiced a procedure called symphysiotomy, where they would cut through the cartilage connecting the mother's pelvic bones to make more room for the baby. This was done without anesthesia, with non-sterile tools, by people who didn't really understand pelvic anatomy. The procedure left women permanently disabled, unable to walk properly, and often incontinent for the rest of their lives. For breech births, where the baby comes out feet first instead of head first, medieval midwives had a terrifying approach. They would grab the baby's feet or legs and simply pull as hard as they could. This often broke the baby's bones, damaged the mother's internal organs, and resulted in the death of both mother and child. Modern medicine knows that breech births require careful, gentle manipulation, but medieval midwives used brute force. Some midwives tried to prevent difficult births through preventive measures that were completely useless and often dangerous. They might tie the woman's legs together during early labor to keep the baby in until they decided it was time. Or they'd force the laboring woman to hold certain positions that actually made birth more difficult and painful. Here's something that sounds like medieval torture because it basically was. If a woman had been in labor for days without progress, some practitioners would hang her upside down and shake her, thinking this would help the baby fall out. This procedure, called succussion, usually caused the woman to pass out, vomit, and sometimes die from the trauma, but they kept doing it because occasionally a baby would be born afterward and they'd credit their technique. Medieval medicine also included the practice of inserting various substances into the birth canal to try to speed up labor. Ground-up beetles, crushed pearls, powdered animal bones, and even human hair were stuffed inside laboring women based on the belief that these materials had magical or medical properties. These foreign substances caused infections, allergic reactions, and internal injuries. If a woman was hemorrhaging after birth, medieval practitioners had several equally useless treatments. They might pack the bleeding area with cobwebs, believing that spider silk had healing properties. They'd insert cloth soaked in vinegar, wine, or herbal mixtures. Some midwives would try to stop bleeding by pressing hot stones against the woman's abdomen, often causing severe burns on top of the internal bleeding. The most dangerous procedures were reserved for the most desperate situations. When both mother and baby seemed likely to die, medieval practitioners would sometimes attempt what they called embryotomy, cutting up the baby while still inside the mother and removing it piece by piece. This procedure had to be done while the mother was conscious and fully aware of what was happening, since there was no anesthesia available. For women who survived traumatic births but suffered ongoing complications, medieval medicine offered treatments that often made things worse. Fistulas, where tears between internal organs caused permanent incontinence, were treated by inserting more foreign objects or burning the damaged tissue with hot irons. These treatments caused additional scarring and usually made the condition worse. The psychological trauma of these procedures was never considered. Women who survived were expected to be grateful and to endure whatever permanent damage resulted from the medical interventions. Chronic pain, disability, and ongoing health problems were simply accepted as normal consequences of childbirth. Perhaps most tragically, these dangerous procedures were often performed not because they were medically necessary, but because doing anything, felt better than doing nothing. Families pressured midwives to try dramatic interventions, and midwives felt they had to attempt these procedures to prove they were earning their payment. The worst part? Some of these dangerous practices persisted for centuries because occasionally, purely by chance, they coincided with a successful birth. If a woman happened to deliver a healthy baby after being subjected to some horrific procedure, everyone would credit the procedure rather than luck. These random successes kept deadly practices alive, generation after generation of women who suffered and died from treatments that did more harm than good. Number 6. Hygiene? Non-existent. Now let's talk about cleanliness during medieval childbirth. Actually, let's not call it cleanliness, because there wasn't any. Let's call it what it was, a perfect breeding ground for infection, disease, and death, where the very act of trying to help deliver a baby was almost guaranteed to introduce deadly bacteria into the situation. Picture where you're going to give birth in medieval times. Forget the sterile white hospital rooms you see in movies. You're laboring in a one-room hut with a dirt floor. Not a clean dirt floor, mind you, but dirt that's been walked on by humans, animals, and whatever else wanders through your house. This floor has absorbed years of spilled food, animal droppings, human waste, and bodily fluids from previous births, illnesses, and daily life. Your birthing bed isn't a bed at all. It's a pile of straw, covered with whatever fabric your family can spare. This straw might be fresh, but probably isn't. It might be the same straw you've been sleeping on for months, accumulating sweat, skin cells, and every microscopic organism that's been living in your house. The fabric covering it hasn't been washed because washing clothes is a massive undertaking that requires hauling water, heating it over a fire, and spending an entire day on laundry. The room where you're giving birth is the same room where your family cooks, eats, sleeps, and stores food. It's probably also where your animals sleep during cold weather. Chickens, goats, pigs, and cattle wander in and out freely, leaving their droppings wherever they please. The smell is a mixture of unwashed human bodies, animal waste, rotting food scraps, and whatever else has been accumulating in your living space. There are no windows with glass, just openings in the walls that might be covered with cloth or animal hides. These openings let in flies, mosquitoes, and other insects that have been feeding on human waste, dead animals, and garbage. During your labor, these insects will be crawling over your sweating body, landing on the baby as it's born, and spreading bacteria from whatever disgusting thing they touch before visiting you. Let's talk about water, the most basic requirement for cleanliness. The water available for your birth comes from the village well, a nearby stream, or collected rainwater. None of these sources are clean by modern standards. The well serves the entire village and is probably contaminated with sewage from latrines. The stream has people and animals urinating and defecating upstream from where you collect water. Rainwater sits in open containers where birds, insects, and small animals can contaminate it. This contaminated water is what the midwife uses to clean her hands and tools. She might rinse her hands in a bowl of water, but that same bowl has been used for multiple purposes throughout the day. The water itself is teeming with bacteria, parasites, and other microorganisms that are about to be introduced into your body during the most vulnerable time of your life. The midwife's hands are a disaster from a hygiene perspective. She's just finished helping milk cows, feeding chickens, preparing food, and using the latrine. She's wiped her nose, scratched her body, and handled countless dirty objects. Her fingernails are long and caked with dirt because cutting nails short isn't common practice. Under those nails are bacteria from everything she's touched in the past several days. When she examines you internally, she's essentially putting all of that contamination directly inside your body. Every time she reaches inside to check your progress or help guide the baby out, she's introducing new bacteria into your birth canal, cervix, and uterus. In a time when people don't understand germ theory, she's inadvertently turning a natural process into a potential death sentence from infection. The cloth and tools the midwife brings aren't clean either. Her knife was probably used for cutting food, trimming animal hooves, or general household tasks before being stuffed into her bag. The strips of cloth for tying off the umbilical cord might be relatively clean, or they might be whatever rags she could find. They certainly haven't been sterilized because that concept doesn't exist yet. Here's where it gets even worse. Medieval people believed that fresh air was dangerous for new mothers and babies. They thought that exposure to moving air would make you sick, so they sealed up the birthing room as tightly as possible. No fresh air circulation, no breeze to carry away the stench and bacteria. Just you, laboring in a sealed room filled with contaminated air, breathing the same germs over and over again. The birthing process itself creates the perfect conditions for infection. You're bleeding, sweating, and producing various bodily fluids. In a modern hospital, these would be cleaned up immediately with sterile materials. In medieval times, they soak into the straw bedding, the dirt floor, and whatever fabric is available. This creates a warm, moist environment where bacteria multiply rapidly. After the baby is born, the umbilical cord is cut with a midwife's dirty knife and tied off with potentially contaminated cloth. The placenta is delivered and often just tossed aside or buried in the dirt floor of the room. Sometimes pieces of placenta are left inside the mother, where they rot and cause deadly infections. The baby's first breath is in this contaminated environment. Its first contact with the world is through the midwife's dirty hands. It's placed on soiled bedding, wrapped in unwashed cloth, and brought to your chest where it encounters whatever bacteria and diseases you're carrying. The newborn's immune system is completely undeveloped, making it incredibly vulnerable to all the pathogens floating around the birthing room. If you tear during delivery, which is common. The midwife might try to stitch you up with whatever thread she has available. This thread hasn't been sterilized, the needle is dirty, and the stitching process introduces even more bacteria into your wounded tissue. The stitches themselves often become infected, leading to painful abscesses and potentially fatal sepsis. Cleaning up after the birth involves wiping blood and fluids with dirty rags, maybe splashing some of that contaminated water around and hoping for the best. The soiled straw might be changed, or it might just be covered with fresh straw on top. The room itself isn't cleaned or disinfected because people don't understand the need for disinfection. Your post-birth recovery takes place in the same contaminated environment. Any tears, stitches, or internal damage are exposed to the same bacteria-rich conditions for days or weeks while you heal. You're weak, your immune system is compromised, and you're surrounded by pathogens that your body can't fight off effectively. The cruel irony is that many women who survive the actual birth process died days or weeks later from infections that could have been prevented with basic hygiene. These infections were so common that they had a name: childbed fever. Women would seem to recover from birth, then develop fever, delirium, and eventually die from overwhelming sepsis. Medieval people noticed that women who gave birth at home with midwives often got sick afterward, but they attributed it to bad air, evil spirits, or moral failings rather than contamination. They had no concept that the very people trying to help them were inadvertently poisoning them with bacteria. Some regions had folk beliefs about cleanliness that made things even worse. They thought that washing too much during pregnancy or after birth would make you weak or susceptible to evil influences. So women were actively discouraged from cleaning themselves when hygiene was most crucial for survival. The lack of hygiene in medieval childbirth wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Modern medicine recognizes that infection is one of the leading historical causes of maternal mortality. Women didn't just die from bleeding or difficult births, they died from preventable infections caused by the complete absence of sterile technique. Number 7. Death of the mother equals danger for the baby. When a medieval mother died in childbirth, which happened with terrifying frequency, her baby's chances of survival dropped to nearly zero. This wasn't just because of the loss of breastfeeding, though that was certainly part of it. In medieval society, motherless newborns faced a cascade of dangers that modern people can barely comprehend. Let's start with the immediate crisis. If the mother died during or shortly after birth, who was going to feed the baby? Infant formula didn't exist. Baby bottles didn't exist. The only nutrition available for newborns was breast milk, and if your mother was dead, that source was gone forever. The lucky babies had wet nurses available, women who had recently given birth themselves and could nurse another child. But wet nurses were expensive, and most families couldn't afford them. Even wealthy families struggled to find suitable wet nurses because women who had just given birth needed to feed their own babies first. The demand for wet nurses far exceeded the supply, leaving most motherless babies without any viable feeding option. Some desperate families tried to feed newborns with animal milk, usually from goats or cows. This sounds reasonable until you understand that medieval people had no way to make animal milk safe for infant consumption. They couldn't pasteurize it, purify it, or modify it to match human milk. Raw animal milk fed to newborns usually caused severe diarrhea, dehydration, and death within days. Other families attempted to feed babies with thin gruels made from grain and water or watered-down ale. These liquid diets provided no proper nutrition for developing infants and often contained harmful bacteria from contaminated water. Babies fed these inadequate substitutes typically died of malnutrition or intestinal infections within a week or two. But even if a motherless baby somehow managed to get adequate nutrition, it faced other deadly challenges. Medieval people believed that newborns who hadn't been baptized would go to hell or limbo if they died. This created a desperate urgency to baptize dying babies, sometimes within hours or minutes of birth. Here's where it gets really dark. If both mother and baby were dying during a difficult birth, medieval church law required that the baby be baptized before the mother received last rites. The dying woman had to wait for religious comfort while the priest focused on the infant's salvation. Some women died alone and uncomforted because their baby's spiritual needs were considered more important. In cases where the baby survived but seemed unlikely to live long, families would rush to have it baptized even if it was clearly dying. Weak, premature, or injured newborns would be carried through harsh weather to the nearest church, often dying from exposure during the journey. But parents felt they had no choice because an unbaptized baby's eternal soul was at stake. Some regions practiced emergency baptism for babies who were born dying. If the infant was too weak to survive transport to a church, the midwife or anyone present could perform the baptism using whatever water was available. These hasty baptisms were often performed on babies who were already dead or dying, more for the family's peace of mind than for any medical benefit to the child. Motherless babies who survived the first few days faced another grim reality. Medieval society had very limited support systems for orphaned infants. Extended family members might take in the baby if they could afford to feed another mouth, but most medieval families were already struggling to feed their own children. Adding a newborn who required constant care and specialized feeding was often impossible. Some babies were given to religious institutions, but medieval monasteries and convents weren't equipped to care for infants. They had no understanding of proper infant nutrition or care, and most babies left at religious houses died quickly from neglect or inappropriate feeding. The institutions accepted these babies out of Christian charity, but they lacked the knowledge and resources to keep them alive. In some communities, motherless babies were passed from woman to woman, each one trying to nurse the child for a few days before passing it along. This constant disruption was traumatic for the infants and exposed them to multiple sources of infection and disease. Most babies subjected to this kind of shared care died from the stress and inconsistent nutrition. Here's something that'll break your heart. Some medieval families made the brutal decision to let motherless newborns die rather than watch them suffer through a prolonged death from starvation. This wasn't cruelty, it was a desperate recognition that without adequate nutrition, the baby would die slowly and painfully over several weeks. Some families chose what they saw as the more merciful option of letting death come quickly. The psychological impact on surviving family members was devastating. Fathers watched their wives die in childbirth, then watched their newborn babies slowly starve to death because there was no way to feed them. Older children saw their mothers die, and their baby siblings follow soon after. The trauma rippled through entire families and communities. Medieval record-keeping was poor, but the records that do exist show that infant mortality rates spiked dramatically when mothers died in childbirth. In some regions, as many as 90% of babies whose mothers died within the first week of birth were dead themselves within a month. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. Some desperate families tried creative solutions that were usually unsuccessful. They might try to feed babies with milk from women who were no longer nursing, but breast milk production stops when it's not regularly stimulated. They might attempt to keep babies alive on sugar water or honey, which provided calories but no proper nutrition and often contained harmful bacteria. The few motherless babies who survived their first year usually grew up malnourished, underdeveloped, and sickly. They had higher rates of disease, disability, and early death throughout their lives. The trauma of losing their mothers at birth, combined with inadequate early nutrition, left lasting effects on their physical and mental development. Religious authorities tried to provide spiritual comfort for these tragic situations, but their advice often made things worse. They taught that these deaths were God's will, that suffering was spiritually beneficial, and that families should accept these losses without questioning divine plan. This spiritual framework provided little practical help and often added guilt to grief. Some families who lost both mother and baby turned their tragedy into cautionary tales, warning other women about the dangers of childbirth. But these stories, meant to encourage prayer and preparation, often increased the terror that pregnant women felt about their upcoming deliveries. The cruel mathematical reality was that maternal death almost always meant infant death in medieval times. Without modern alternatives like infant formula, breast pumps, or neonatal intensive care, motherless babies had virtually no chance of survival. The death of one family member usually meant the death of two, doubling the tragedy and devastating families who were already struggling to survive in harsh conditions. This connection between maternal and infant survival created additional pressure for women during childbirth. They knew that dying wouldn't just end their own lives, but would doom their babies as well. This knowledge added psychological stress to an already traumatic experience, as laboring women fought not just for their own survival, but for their children's lives as well. Number 8. Weird birth amulets and charms. When medical knowledge fails, desperation turns to magic. Medieval women facing the deadly lottery of childbirth surrounded themselves with a bizarre collection of amulets, charms, and talismans that were supposed to provide protection, ease labor, and ensure survival. These objects weren't just superstitious trinkets, they were lifelines of hope in a world where hope was often all you had. Let's start with the most precious and sought-after birth charm, the Virgin Mary's girdle. Not the actual girdle, of course, but pieces of cloth or rope that were claimed to be fragments of the belt worn by Mary during Jesus' birth. These authentic relics were incredibly valuable, passed down through generations of women or borrowed from wealthy families for the duration of labor. The belief was that wearing Mary's girdle would provide divine protection and ease the pain of childbirth, since Mary was the most famous mother in Christian history. Women would tie these cloth strips around their waists, hold them during contractions, or place them on their abdomens while laboring. The psychological comfort might have been real, but the medical benefits were non-existent. Of course, most of these authentic girdle fragments were fake, created by enterprising merchants who saw a profitable market in desperate mothers. Families would spend enormous amounts of money on what were essentially random pieces of old cloth, believing they were purchasing divine intervention. The black market in fake holy relics was huge, and pregnant women were prime targets for these scams. Eagle stones, also called etites, were another popular birth charm. These were hollow stones that contained smaller stones inside, creating a rattling sound when shaken. Medieval people believed that these stones, formed naturally, had special powers to ease childbirth because the stone inside another stone reminded them of a baby inside its mother's womb. Pregnant women would wear eagle stones as pendants or tie them to their thighs during labor. The stones were supposed to speed up delivery and prevent complications. They were extremely expensive because they were rare and had to be imported from distant lands. Wealthy families might own a family eagle stone that was passed down through generations, while poorer families might borrow or rent them for individual births. Coral was another prized birth charm, believed to protect against evil spirits and ensure safe delivery. Red coral was especially valued because its color reminded people of blood, which was associated with life and vitality. Women wore coral necklaces, bracelets, or rings during pregnancy and labor, thinking the stone would ward off supernatural dangers. Jasper stones were thought to have specific power over childbirth because of their color and supposed connection to blood and fertility. Green jasper was believed to ease labor pains, while red jasper was thought to prevent excessive bleeding. Women would hold these stones during contractions or place them on their bodies in strategic locations. Here's where things get really strange. Some birth charms were made from animal parts that were supposed to transfer beneficial qualities to the laboring mother. Bear claws were prized because bears were seen as powerful and protective mothers. Wolf teeth were thought to give women the strength to endure long labors. Rabbit feet were believed to encourage quick, easy births because rabbits reproduce so rapidly and seemingly effortlessly. Snake skins were particularly valued as birth charms, especially if they had been shed naturally rather than taken from killed snakes. The symbolism was that snakes gave birth to themselves by shedding their old skins, representing renewal and successful transformation. Women would wear strips of snake skin around their waists or keep them nearby during labor. Some of the strangest birth charms were made from human materials. Pieces of the umbilical cords from previous successful births were dried, preserved, and worn as protective amulets. Hair from women who had survived multiple childbirths was woven into bracelets or necklaces. These charms were based on the belief that materials from successful births would transfer that success to new mothers. Lodestones, natural magnets, were thought to have special power to draw babies from the womb. Women would hold these magnetic rocks during labor, believing that their attractive force would help pull the baby out faster. Some midwives would wave lodestones over laboring women's bodies, thinking the magnetic field would somehow assist in delivery. Written charms were also common, though most medieval women couldn't read them. These were pieces of parchment or cloth with prayers, biblical verses, or magical formulas written in Latin or other languages the local population couldn't understand. The mysterious writing was supposed to contain divine or magical power that would protect mother and child. Some of these written charms contained specific prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, who was considered the patron saint of childbirth. According to legend, Margaret was swallowed by a dragon but burst out of its belly alive, making her a symbol of safe delivery from dangerous situations. Women would clutch these Margaret prayers during labor, hoping the saint would intercede on their behalf. Birth girdles were cloth belts inscribed with prayers, magical symbols, or images of saints. These weren't just worn around the waist. They were also used to measure the circumference of sacred objects like altar stones or holy relics, supposedly transferring spiritual power to the fabric. The girdles would then be worn during labor or placed over the laboring woman's body. Iron amulets were extremely popular because iron was believed to protect against evil spirits and witchcraft. Women wore iron rings, carried iron nails, or kept iron horseshoes in their birthing rooms. The belief was that supernatural forces that might complicate childbirth would be repelled by the presence of iron. Some families invested in elaborate birth belts made from expensive materials and decorated with multiple charms. These belts might contain blessed stones, metal amulets, written prayers, and pieces of various holy relics all sewn together into one comprehensive protective system. Wealthy women might own several of these elaborate belts, choosing different ones for different pregnancies. Here's something that sounds almost modern. Some medieval birth charms were made from crystals and gemstones that were supposed to have specific healing properties. Amethyst was thought to prevent drunkenness and ensure clear thinking during labor. Sapphire was believed to protect against poison and infection. Diamond was supposed to give strength and courage to enduring women. The most expensive and elaborate birth charms were birthing rolls, long strips of parchment covered with prayers, biblical scenes, and magical symbols. These rolls could be several feet long and contain dozens of different protective elements. Women would unroll them during labor, surrounding themselves with as much spiritual and magical protection as possible. But here's the tragic irony. While women were spending fortunes on these magical protections, they were neglecting practical preparations that might have actually helped. Money spent on fake holy relics could have been used for better nutrition during pregnancy, cleaner birthing conditions, or hiring more experienced midwives. The psychological effect of these charms was probably their only real benefit. Women who believed they were protected by powerful amulets might have felt calmer and more confident during labor, which could have had some positive impact on the birthing process. But the charms themselves had no medical value whatsoever. Many of these birth charms were passed down through families, accumulating the hopes and fears of generations of women. A coral necklace might have been worn by a dozen mothers over the centuries, each one hoping it would be their protection against death. These family heirlooms carried enormous emotional weight along with their supposed magical properties. The market for birth charms created an entire industry of craftsmen, merchants, and fake holy relic producers who profited from women's desperation. Pregnant women and their families were easy targets for expensive magical solutions because the stakes were literally life and death. Number 9. The aftermath of survival. Congratulations, you survived medieval childbirth. You beat the odds, outlasted the agony, and somehow managed to deliver your baby without dying in the process. You're one of the lucky ones, right? Well, hold on to that celebration, because surviving the birth was just the beginning of a lifetime of consequences that modern medicine would consider completely preventable and utterly tragic. Let's start with what your body looks like after a medieval birth. If you were lucky enough to have a normal delivery, you're still dealing with tears, cuts, and internal damage that happened during labor. But there's no modern surgical repair, no antibiotics to prevent infection, and no pain medication to help you heal. Whatever damage occurred during birth, you'll live with for the rest of your life. Many women develop fistulas, which are abnormal openings between internal organs caused by prolonged or difficult labor. The most common were vesicovaginal fistulas, where tears created a connection between the bladder and vagina, or rectovaginal fistulas, connecting the rectum and vagina. This meant that urine or feces would leak constantly through the vagina, making you permanently incontinent and creating a constant smell of waste. These fistulas made normal life impossible. You couldn't control when or where bodily waste would emerge. You constantly smelled of urine or feces. Your clothing was perpetually soiled. Sexual relations became impossible or extremely painful. You were essentially trapped in your own home because appearing in public was too embarrassing and distressing for both you and everyone around you. Medieval medicine had no solution for fistulas. The concept of surgical repair wouldn't be developed for centuries. So, women with these conditions simply learned to live with them. They stuffed rags between their legs to absorb the constant leakage. They avoided social gatherings. They slept separately from their husbands. They became living casualties of the birthing process. Pelvic organ prolapse was another common aftermath of medieval childbirth. The physical trauma of birth could cause the uterus, bladder, or rectum to drop from their normal positions and push against or through the vaginal opening. This condition caused constant discomfort, difficulty walking, and problems with basic bodily functions. Women with severe prolapse might feel like their internal organs were falling out of their bodies, because in many cases, that's exactly what was happening. They develop painful pressure, difficulty urinating or defecating, and chronic pain during any physical activity. Some women couldn't walk normally or sit comfortably for the rest of their lives. The medieval treatment for prolapse was usually a pessary, which was basically any object that could be inserted into the vagina to hold the prolapsed organs in place. These might be carved wood, stone, or metal objects that were custom-made by local craftsmen. They weren't designed by medical professionals because medical professionals didn't exist. These pessaries were uncomfortable, frequently fell out, and often caused additional infections or injuries. They needed to be removed and cleaned regularly, but many women couldn't afford to replace them when they broke or became too damaged to use. The pessary itself became another source of ongoing medical problems. Chronic pain was virtually universal among women who survived difficult births. The physical trauma to muscles, ligaments, and bones created lasting discomfort that had no effective treatment. Women developed arthritis in their backs and hips from prolonged labor in uncomfortable positions. They suffered nerve damage from babies pressing against vital structures during birth. This chronic pain affected every aspect of daily life. Simple tasks like walking, lifting, bending, or carrying became exercises in endurance. Women who needed to work in fields, care for children, or perform household duties did so while managing constant physical discomfort. Pain relief didn't exist, so they simply learned to function while hurting. Sexual dysfunction was another common consequence of traumatic birth. Tears, scars, and nerve damage made sexual relations painful or impossible. Many women lost all sexual sensation due to injury during delivery. Others experienced such severe pain during intercourse that they avoided sexual contact entirely, which often created marital problems and social pressure to have more children despite their physical inability to enjoy or tolerate sex. Emotional trauma was completely ignored in medieval times, but was undoubtedly present in women who survived horrific birthing experiences. Today we recognize that traumatic births can cause post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. Medieval women who endured days of agony, thought they were going to die, or lost babies during traumatic deliveries certainly experienced psychological damage. But medieval society had no concept of emotional healing or trauma recovery. Women were expected to be grateful for survival and to immediately return to their normal duties. There was no time for emotional processing, no understanding of psychological wounds, and no support for women who were struggling mentally after difficult births. Many women developed what we would now recognize as severe depression after traumatic births. They lost interest in daily activities, struggled to bond with their babies, and felt overwhelming sadness or hopelessness. But medieval people interpreted these symptoms as spiritual failings or moral weakness, not as predictable responses to trauma. Infection was an ongoing threat for weeks or months after birth. Any tears or damage to the body could become infected, leading to fever, pain, and potentially death long after the birth itself was over. Women who survived the initial birth might die weeks later from infections that developed in their healing wounds. Some women developed chronic infections that never fully healed. These ongoing infections caused fever, fatigue, and weakness that made normal life difficult or impossible. They might suffer from recurring episodes of severe illness for years after giving birth, slowly weakening their overall health and reducing their life expectancy. Nutritional deficiencies became worse after birth because women were expected to nurse their babies while continuing to do physical labor and often going without adequate food themselves. The physical demands of breastfeeding, combined with poor medieval diets and ongoing health problems from the birth, left many women malnourished and weak. Subsequent pregnancies became increasingly dangerous for women who had suffered trauma during previous births. Scar tissue, organ damage, and weakened pelvic structures made each additional birth more likely to cause complications. But medieval society expected women to continue having children regardless of their physical condition. Many women who survived their first difficult birth knew that future pregnancies would likely kill them, but they had no choice but to risk it anyway. Contraception was unreliable and often forbidden by the church. Husbands expected sexual access and children. Society pressured women to produce large families despite the personal cost. The psychological burden of knowing that your next pregnancy might be your last created constant anxiety for women who had barely survived previous births. They lived with the knowledge that sexual relations could lead to a pregnancy that would kill them, but they had no power to refuse or prevent it. Despite all these consequences, medieval society considered women who survived childbirth to be blessed and fortunate. There was no acknowledgement of the ongoing suffering they endured, no recognition of the price they paid for survival, and no support for the physical and emotional challenges they faced for the rest of their lives. Women who lived with fistulas, prolapse, chronic pain, and disability were expected to be grateful that they hadn't died. Their ongoing suffering was invisible to a society that only measured success by whether mother and baby survived the immediate birth. The quality of that survival, the price of that survival, and the long-term cost of that survival were completely ignored. Number 10. Childbirth as a test of faith. We've reached the final and perhaps most cruel aspect of medieval childbirth, the religious framework that surrounded it. Because in medieval Christian society, your agony wasn't just bad luck or poor medical care. It was God's will. Your suffering wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a spiritual test to be endured. And your potential death wasn't a medical tragedy. It was divine judgment on your moral worth. The foundation of this thinking came from Genesis 3 verse 16, where God tells Eve, "I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children." Medieval church authorities interpreted this not as a description of human biology, but as a divine prescription for female suffering. Every contraction, every scream, every drop of blood was seen as payment for Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden. This wasn't metaphorical theology. It was practical medical doctrine. Church leaders taught that women were supposed to suffer during childbirth. If you weren't in agony, you weren't properly fulfilling your spiritual role as a woman. Pain relief wasn't just unavailable. It was morally wrong. To seek comfort during labor was to rebel against God's plan for female punishment. Picture being pregnant in 1355 and listening to Sunday sermons that reminded you, week after week, that your upcoming labor would be both physically agonizing and spiritually necessary. The priest would explain that your pain was inherited punishment for Eve's disobedience, that your suffering would purify your soul, and that enduring childbirth agony without complaint was your duty as a Christian woman. The church taught that the amount of pain you experienced during childbirth was directly related to your spiritual condition. If you suffered more, it meant you were a greater sinner who needed more purification. If your labor was unusually long or difficult, it was because God was testing your faith more severely than other women. Your agony became a measure of your moral failings. This created a twisted psychology where women were afraid to pray for easier births because that would suggest they were trying to avoid God's righteous punishment. Instead, they were encouraged to pray for strength to endure whatever suffering God chose to inflict upon them. The goal wasn't to reduce pain, but to suffer with Christian dignity and acceptance. Medieval sermons often used Mary, the mother of Jesus, as an example of how women should approach childbirth. But here's the cruel irony. Church doctrine held that Mary was born without original sin, meaning she didn't deserve the punishment of painful labor that other women faced. So while Mary was held up as the perfect example of holy motherhood, her experience was completely irrelevant to ordinary women who were supposedly paying for Eve's sin. This created an impossible standard. Women were told to be like Mary, humble and accepting, while enduring agony that Mary herself never experienced. It was like telling someone to be brave while facing a dragon, then holding up as your example someone who never encountered the dragon in the first place. The church also taught that surviving childbirth was entirely dependent on God's grace and your spiritual worthiness. If you died, it meant God had judged you and found you wanting. If you lived, it was because divine mercy had spared you despite your sins. This framework removed any human agency or medical understanding from the birthing process. Everything was predestined based on your relationship with God. This religious interpretation had devastating psychological effects on medieval women. If your labor was particularly difficult, you'd spend the entire experience wondering what sins you'd committed to deserve such punishment. If your baby died, you'd assume it was because you weren't holy enough to deserve a living child. If you died, your family would believe it was evidence of your moral failings rather than medical complications. Medieval women wrote wills when they discovered they were pregnant, not just because death was likely, but because the church encouraged them to prepare their souls for divine judgment. These weren't just practical legal documents. They were spiritual confessions where women listed their sins and begged God for mercy during their upcoming trial by childbirth. The church required women to confess their sins before going into labor, as if childbirth were a form of divine trial that required spiritual preparation. You'd kneel before a priest, list every moral failing you could remember, and receive absolution before facing what might be your death. The implication was that unconfessed sins might doom you during labor. During the actual birth, women were encouraged to pray continuously, not for pain relief or easier delivery, but for strength to endure whatever suffering God chose to inflict. Popular prayers focused on accepting divine will, asking for spiritual courage, and offering up your pain as penance for your sins. You were supposed to welcome the agony as a form of purification. Some religious orders taught that women who complained during labor, screamed excessively, or begged for relief were displaying spiritual weakness and pride. The ideal Christian woman was supposed to suffer in silent dignity, trusting in God's plan even as she faced potential death. Crying out in pain was seen as rebellion against divine judgment. This religious framework made it nearly impossible for medieval people to develop better medical approaches to childbirth. If pain and death were God's will, then trying to prevent them was essentially fighting against divine plan. Medical intervention wasn't just unavailable, it was potentially blasphemous. When early forms of pain relief became available, religious authorities often opposed them. They argued that eliminating the pain of childbirth was interfering with God's punishment of womankind. This religious resistance to medical progress lasted for centuries, keeping women suffering long after better options existed. The Church also taught that maternal death during childbirth could be spiritually beneficial if the woman accepted her fate with proper Christian submission. A woman who died in childbirth while maintaining faith and humility was considered to have achieved a form of martyrdom. Her suffering and death were transformed into spiritual victory, which sounds beautiful until you realize it provided comfort to grieving families by romanticizing preventable tragedy. Religious authorities encouraged families to see maternal death as part of God's plan for salvation. The woman's suffering was portrayed as Christ-like, her death as a sacrifice that brought spiritual benefits to her family and community. This interpretation helped people cope with loss, but also discouraged efforts to prevent future deaths. Medieval Christianity taught that the physical world was temporary and less important than spiritual concerns. This worldview made people more accepting of physical suffering because earthly pain was seen as preparation for eternal reward. Women were taught that their childbirth agony was temporary suffering that would be rewarded in heaven, making it easier to accept and less urgent to prevent. The concept of original sin created a framework where female suffering was not just inevitable, but deserved. Eve's disobedience in Eden had cursed all women with painful childbirth, and every laboring mother was paying that inherited debt. This wasn't unfair cosmic punishment. It was justice for humanity's first sin. This religious interpretation extended beyond the birth itself to infant mortality. If babies died during or shortly after birth, it was explained as God's will, perhaps because the child was needed in heaven or because the parents needed to learn spiritual lessons through loss. These explanations provided comfort but also prevented people from seeking practical solutions to infant death. Women who survived multiple difficult births were sometimes viewed as especially blessed by God, chosen to endure repeated trials as evidence of their spiritual strength. But women who died in their first or second births weren't seen as unlucky. They were viewed as called home by God at the appointed time. The Church taught that preparing for childbirth should focus on spiritual readiness rather than physical preparation. Women were encouraged to pray more, confess more frequently, and purify their souls rather than improving their nutrition, seeking better medical care, or learning about the birthing process. Spiritual preparation was seen as more important than physical preparation. Medieval religious authorities also promoted the idea that childless women were incomplete in God's eyes, and that risking death in childbirth was preferable to remaining barren. This created enormous pressure for women to attempt pregnancy, even when previous births had nearly killed them or left them permanently disabled. The Church's teaching about female submission extended into the birthing room, where women were expected to accept whatever happened without questioning God's will. Fighting for your life during a difficult birth could be interpreted as lacking faith in divine plan. Women were supposed to submit to whatever outcome God chose, whether that was survival or death. Some medieval mystics and religious writers actually celebrated the parallel between women's childbirth suffering and Christ's crucifixion. They argued that women could achieve spiritual union with Jesus through the agony of labor, making their pain a form of religious experience. This interpretation elevated suffering to a sacramental level, making it not just acceptable, but spiritually valuable. Religious art from the medieval period often depicted childbirth as a spiritual battle between good and evil forces, with angels and demons fighting over the souls of mother and child. This imagery reinforced the idea that birth was primarily a spiritual event rather than a medical one, and that prayers were more important than practical care. The most devastating aspect of this religious framework was how it prevented medieval society from developing compassion for maternal suffering. If women's pain was divinely ordained punishment, then feeling sorry for them or trying to help them was essentially disagreeing with God's justice. This theological justification for indifference to female suffering kept medical progress stalled for centuries. But perhaps the cruelest element was the teaching that women who died in childbirth had failed a test of faith. Their deaths weren't tragic accidents or medical failures. They were spiritual defeats. This interpretation added shame and blame to grief, making the loss of wives, daughters, and mothers even more painful for surviving families. As we conclude this journey through medieval childbirth, remember that these weren't just historical curiosities or ancient superstitions. These were real women, facing real terror, enduring real agony, and dying real deaths while society told them their suffering was holy and their deaths were deserved. The next time you see a romantic medieval movie with beautiful ladies in flowing gowns, remember the women who paid the price for those bloodlines. Remember the mothers who died screaming in agony, while priests told them it was God's will. Remember the babies who starved to death because their mothers couldn't survive to nurse them. And remember that the medical advances we take for granted today, from antibiotics to anesthesia to cesarean sections, represent thousands of years of human suffering that we've finally learned to prevent. Every woman who gives birth in a modern hospital owes her survival to the countless mothers who died before we knew better. Medieval childbirth wasn't just dangerous. It was a window into a worldview that saw female suffering as natural, necessary, and holy. Breaking free from that worldview took centuries of medical progress, social change, and the gradual recognition that women's lives and pain mattered as much as anyone else's. Tonight, when you go to sleep in your clean bed with access to modern medicine, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. And remember the medieval mothers who never made it home from their labors, who died believing their agony was deserved, and who never lived to see a world where childbirth could be safe, comfortable, and joyful rather than a deadly test of faith. The story of medieval childbirth is ultimately a story about the value of human life, the importance of medical knowledge, and the danger of accepting suffering as inevitable just because it's always existed. These women deserve better than they got, and their legacy is every modern mother who survives what would have killed her medieval sisters. Their pain wasn't holy. Their deaths weren't deserved. Their suffering wasn't God's will. It was simply what happened when medical ignorance met social indifference to female life. And remembering that truth is how we honor their memory and ensure that such unnecessary tragedy never becomes normal again.